Donald Trump's attorney general claims it will create jobs, the rescinding of the Obama-era decree that allows so-called dreamers to stay in the United States. It means 800,000 undocumented residents, all of whom arrived before the age of 16, now face the threat of deportation to the land of their parents. Trump has made the repeal of DACA, as it's known, a campaign pledge alongside the building of that wall along the Mexican border. And while Americans grapple over the fate of dreamers and immigration reform over in the UK, it's legal migrants that are in the crosshairs of the government, it seems. A leaked memo calls for tighter controls on letting families in and a selection that would mete out unskilled EU workers after Brexit. It's this Britain First sentiment that led a majority of citizens there to vote for leaving the European Union. And while attitudes to Brexit may have since wavered, the anti-immigrant feelings, say pollsters, is arguably just as strong. And so the question begs, can an open society coexist with closed borders? Is moving to another country to earn a living a right or a privilege? Where's it all going? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the blowback against immigration. With us, Nancy Green, who teaches at EHESS, Paris's School of Higher Learning and Social Studies. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us from Washington. Roy Beck, president of the immigration reduction lobby group Numbers USA. Welcome to the show.
Greetings.
Also in the U.S. Capitol, James Kirchick, visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute and the author of The End of Europe. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And from London, Rory Broomfield, director of the Freedom Association and the Better Off Out campaign. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The state of New York is banding together with other states to challenge the legality of President Trump's Tuesday rollback of the Dreamer program. Legal limbo awaits many, as Elizabeth Walsh reports.
26-year-old Tomas Pendola teaches chemistry at one of the best high schools in Florida, where he has lived since he was 10 years old. In 2001, his family fled the financial crisis in Argentina that forced half the population into poverty. He has grown up in the United States thanks to DACA, which has granted work permits and deportation relief to nearly 800,000 unauthorized immigrants who arrived in the country before the age of 16.
So for me, the way that DACA changed my life is that it allowed me to stay in the U.S. and give back to the U.S. as opposed to just get my degree and have to leave.
But Donald Trump has announced plans to end the program, leaving Congress with 6 months to find a legal replacement. Without the program, Tomas would be forced to abandon his hopes to pursue a degree in chemistry, as well as the opportunity to continue to teach. While he could return to Argentina, for others from countries like Honduras, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, he points out that deportation could put their lives at risk.
And this is like how most undocumented immigrants feel, because I mean, only 800,000 of us have DACA, but there's 11 million of us who feel like they don't belong, like they're always scared.
Tomas feels American, but like others, he struggles with the legal insecurity.
And you grew up in a country where they're telling you that you don't belong here. I mean, you feel American. Everything that America stands for, you do as well. Freedom, liberty, opportunity, that's all that you want for yourself and for your family. And yet, people are telling you you don't belong here.
Lawmakers on both sides have joined the outcry from Silicon Valley executives like Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, and others from the financial sector and other industries who oppose the White House decision. For now, Tomas and thousands of others wait in limbo for Congress to act.
Roy Beck, what would you like to see happen to Tomas?
Well, people like Tomas, based on what I just heard, have a compelling story. And the majority of people who got DACA work permits have compelling stories. The thing that public policy has to deal with is balancing that against the compelling stories of the millions of Americans who are struggling, either struggling on low and stagnant wages or struggling without a job. There are 50 million working-age Americans that do not have jobs. Now, not all of them need a job, but a good share of them live in or near poverty. And so when you add hundreds of thousands, and in our case in America, millions of immigrants with work permits every decade to the labor force, you increase the supply and increase also the demand, but not as much. So we have to figure out a way, if we're going to help people like Tomas, we have to figure out a way how to reduce the harm to the most vulnerable Americans.
So you're suggesting that Tomas is taking a job away from, say, another high school chemistry teacher? That's his job right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly on the high school chemistry teacher, but I do know that the vast majority of the people who got DACA they're not college graduates, and they work in construction and manufacturing and hospitality and other service jobs, just like the majority of Americans do. And on a case-by-case basis, you have to really determine what is the damage to the opportunity for Americans. 15 million millennials in the prime physical part of their life are not working right now. 15 million American millennials. So it does, yes, it makes a real difference. Plus, it tends to depress the wages, especially at the lower end.
Nancy Green?
Well, I think certainly, I think everybody deserves a break, and there are questions about the types of jobs that all Americans as well as immigrants have in the United States. But I think if we think about it historically, it's clear that the history of immigration to the United States has actually been often contradictory, or has had a long history of going back and forth. There has been anti-immigrant sentiment over the years, since immigration began in a large way in the middle of the 19th century. So there's always been restrictionist tendencies, but there has also been a long-standing and a very important theme in American history, which is that of assimilation and of the power of immigrants to help the United States. That is part of American history. I don't think that has changed today. Those who are now at risk under the new measure belong to that history itself. As Tomas said, he feels American. These are people who came here very young and who feel that they are part of American society. They have done what other Americans have done, that Americans have done. They have found jobs, they have done schooling, and we can't forget that immigrants help the economy, and this is something which has been historically true and I think will continue to be true for the future.
But you heard Roy Beck say that they're taking away jobs. Of course, the U.S. right now has full employment. So
this is actually one of the comments I would have made as well. The unemployment rate in the United States is very, very low. It is true there are not all jobs are good jobs, but people are at work. And it has been rare historically that immigrants take away jobs from American-born citizens. What often happens is that they take jobs that people don't want or that can't be filled. And this is one of the things that today is under discussion.
All right, the Attorney General calls Obama's Dreamer program unconstitutional, adding that it's stolen hundreds of thousands of jobs from U.S. citizens.
We are people of compassion, and we are people of law. But there is nothing compassionate about the failure to enforce immigration laws. Enforcing the law saves lives, protects communities and taxpayers, and prevents human suffering. Failure to enforce the laws in the past has put our nation at risk of crime, violence, and terrorism.
Jamie Kirchick, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I support DACA. I don't believe it's in the interest of the United States to be deporting people who have lived here for most of their lives and are contributing. They're not criminals. They're high school graduates. They're college graduates. They're starting businesses. It's very cruel to kick them out of the country. But on the specific question of the legality of this measure, I think that the Attorney General might have a point. I mean, President Obama unilaterally enacted this policy through executive order in 2012 because Congress wouldn't pass a bill to his liking. And that's not how the system works in the United States. The president just can't create laws out of thin air. He has to sign them into passage after they're written in Congress. And so I'm really torn about this because I believe in the rule of law, and I don't think the president can just go around creating laws out of thin air. And interestingly, Donald Trump might seem to agree with me here because he's announced that he's going to take DACA off the books in 6 months. So he's given Congress a 6-month period in which they can try to come to some sort of agreement between Democrats and Republicans where perhaps they can inscribe DACA into law. Now, that might require, the more pro-immigration people like myself in Congress, the Democrats, it might require them to give up something. They might have to agree to funding for the wall, or they might have to agree to, lower numbers of unskilled legal immigrants. But that's what democracy is. It's about compromises.
Why is this, again, coming to a head now at a time when unemployment is so low in the United States?
Oh.
Well, it has nothing to do. It has nothing.
That's the youth.
Jamie Kirchick, go ahead.
Well, it has nothing to do with the employment levels. It's because this law is about to expire, and you have several attorneys general in many states who are going to sue the federal government if they allow this DACA policy to continue, and they have a very strong legal case. So this policy was coming to a head, and it's now up to our elected representatives in Congress to do something about it. They can't keep on kicking this can down the road.
Roy Beck?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that we do have to remember that, yes, the official U3 unemployment rate of people who looked for a job last month is very low, and that's great. But the people who looked for a job 2 months ago or 3 months ago who are discouraged, and people who live in poverty and are not working, that number is huge. 15 million millennials and 50 million working age Americans are not in the labor market. So we have huge pockets of poverty around this country. And people who need to be recruited. Businesses don't recruit among the poor African Americans, the poor Hispanic Americans, the poor rural whites. They don't recruit among them because they don't need to, because our immigration system provides them with such a flow of very eager foreign laborers. The foreign laborers are great. They're hardworking. They're very motivated. So you have to remember that. I also want to correct a couple of things. DACA was not about deportations. DACA was about giving benefits, and that's the reason why a similar amnesty that was given by President Obama was ruled against by the federal courts. It mainly is about giving work permits. President Trump has already said in his administration they're not going to be looking for DACA people to deport. They weren't being deported except in very, very small numbers under President Bush, very small numbers under President Obama. This is all about who gets the work permits. And I know we're going to talk a little, I hope we'll talk a little more about the fact that I did say that I believe that these DACA people are deserving type people, but we have to come up with a compromise very similar to what was just mentioned, something that would reduce the future flow of legal immigrants into the labor pool to offset, compensate for adding these hundreds of thousands of people to the permanent labor force.
Rory Broomfield, when you listen to this conversation from London, what are your thoughts?
Well, obviously, I'm not a US citizen and I don't know that much about DACA, but from what I hear, I understand that there's a lot of parallels between the conversations happening in the US and the conversations happening in the UK over the new immigration policy, especially regarding numbers and regarding youth unemployment. This is an issue going forward that the UK would need to look at and solve. So inspiration from the debates happening in the States, I think, will be very helpful.
When it comes to that border wall that we've been talking about that Donald Trump wants, the Pew Research Center a few months back did a survey and found that the closer you get to the Mexican border, the less Republican support there is for making the wall a priority. Let me ask you about that, Nancy Green. How do you explain that?
Well, I think that people who are closer to the border also understand perhaps what the difficulties are. The border barriers have existed for quite a while now, and every time there is an extension of the border, then people just start moving and trying to cross at other points, many of which are even more dangerous than the places where they would have crossed otherwise. I think to talk about a wall when there's already, of course, a very extensive form of border control that is there. It's not always exactly clear what is going to be added and how and where, but it's clear that there are issues with regard to how this will be able to take effect. And as we know, it will have an impact both on people on both sides of the border. And I think that this is something which has been, it doesn't seem to be a fully thought out plan exactly how it's going to take effect.
Why is this such a big issue is the question.
I think similar to even the DACA issue, there is and is being, I think, increasingly, we're in a period which is historically not new of having a increasing sentiment of anti-immigration, which is in contradiction with certain economic issues which have been discussed. So that there is sometimes working, I think, at cross purposes. And the issue, in fact, of immigration into the United States is different from the issue of what to do with people who are already there, who came as children, who didn't necessarily choose themselves to come. Some of them came as children. And I think that there are different issues and that maybe they need to be separated. This is not right now a wall issue, but obviously it's all part of the same discussion.
All part of the same discussion. It's quite a toxic conversation, Jamie Kirchick. We've seen all the protests of the last 24 hours. We heard earlier the Attorney General correlating this issue with a failure to prevent terrorism in the United States. Is the U.S. changing?
Well, certainly on this issue of immigration. I mean, I never really thought that a candidate running for president on such a restrictionist immigration policy would win. I mean, if you compare Donald Trump to the last Republican president, George W. Bush, who tried to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill with Ted Kennedy during his presidency. I mean, it is a real shift, and the immigration hawks within the GOP basically won. They basically took over that party. And they're going to have to be accommodated. I mean, a lot of people on the other side of this issue, of which I include myself, they're acting as if, we won the election, as if our side won this election. But, we didn't. There was a presidential election last year, and the candidate who ran on a very restrictionist platform, he won. He won the presidency. And that's a democratic result, and it needs to be grappled with.
And it needs to be recognized. Jamie Kirchick, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at why immigration is such a hot-button issue, both in the U.S. and over here in Europe at this particular point in time, in this era of globalization. We've been talking about the Dreamer program being rescinded in the U.S. We're going to take a look in a moment to a leaked document out of the UK that's causing waves this Wednesday. With us, Nancy Green. She teaches at the French Institute for Higher Learning, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. What's on the course load this year, this semester?
Comparative migration. What else? The history. I'm a historian, actually.
Okay. With us from Washington, Roy Beck, founder and CEO of Numbers USA, which argues for curbing immigration and for, as well, immigration reform. From Washington as well, Jamie Kirchick, who is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute, the author of The End of Europe. Welcome back to you. Welcome back as well to Rory Broomfield, director of the Freedom Association and the Better Off Out campaign. Yeah, over in the UK, a leaked government document shows the cabinet at work on a Britain First policy when it comes to employing EU citizens post-Brexit, with more restrictions on unskilled workers and tighter restrictions on family members joining migrants. Ellen Gainsford has more on that.
The document was marked as sensitive, only meant for the eyes of senior government figures. Released by British newspaper The Guardian, it reveals plans to dramatically cut immigration from the European Union after Brexit. The tough stance taken in the paper has shocked EU officials.
I sincerely hope that this is not the Home Office position. I think that would be a very discriminatory treatment of European citizens. So I think it wouldn't take us forward in the direction that would be beneficial for both the UK citizens and the European Union.
The paper lays out plans to put the needs of British workers first, to judge immigration on whether it benefits society as a whole, not just the migrants. It proposes bringing down the number of low-skilled EU migrants, offering them residency for a maximum of 2 years, and places new restrictions on bringing in family members. While he refused to comment on the leaked document, the Defence Secretary echoed its message.
We don't want to shut the door, people bringing their skills and making their contribution to Britain. Equally, we want more British companies to invest in the British workforce, to train up their workers, to make sure we have a better skilled workforce for them to draw on. So we have to strike the right balance. Overall, the public want immigration to come down in total.
The leaked plan doesn't yet represent official government policy, and may change extensively after discussions with Parliament and EU officials.
Rory Broomfield, what does your crystal ball tell you? Will this be the UK government's policy once there's Brexit?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, it is an internal document. It's a discussion document for many departments in government. And as your reporter said, it will be possibly amended as the immigration bill is introduced into Parliament and it goes through Parliament into law. What was interesting about the report, though, oh, sorry, if I may continue. What was interesting about the report, though, is a concept of Britain First. This is not the leak report. This is a report just seen on your programme. I don't believe there is a Britain First concept here. It's merely addressing a long-standing problem in our immigration system, which has been, because we've been EU members, we've had free movement of people with the EU member states, but not with the rest of the world. And as a result, we have had a two-tier system with immigration on the one hand coming from the EU and on the other hand coming from outside the EU with more restrictive practices. And I suppose much like the debate in the US, what we're looking to do is have a nationality neutral plan where we preference higher skilled individuals over those who are of lower skilled nature.
But that's not what we heard in that report. Defense Secretary Fallon saying he was talking about a preference when it came to defense contracts for UK companies, and the report itself, the leaked report, which again, as you say, is a working document, talks about advising, pushing in favor of a preference for British employees for companies looking ahead. It does sound like a Britain First policy.
Well, as it stands with the European Union, it is equality across the EU, but again, not with regards to people coming in from outside the European Union. I know many people from outside the EU who have actually been asked to leave the UK despite having qualifications from universities like Cornell or the LSE or Oxford. They've been asked to leave because of the stringent non-EU immigration patterns. And I think what Michael Fallon was saying was quite right when it comes to preference for defence contracts. Of course, defence is a specialised industry in many ways, specialised sector, and it's right to have confidence that the people who are employed are not just the highest skill, but also are engaged in sensitive, or have sensitivity clearance or particular clearance, which is, I think, proper for that particular sector.
London Mayor Sadiq Khan saying this will effectively help to strangle the capital's economy. What's your reaction to that?
Well, London hosts many people from around the world. It's not just an EU financial centre, it's a global financial centre, along with global legal centre and tech centre and the rest. The idea is to, in effect, equalise immigration. I would expect that to be part of the final bill presented to Parliament, where there be a nationality-neutral element to it. And certainly the book that I co-authored with Ian Murray of the Competitive Enterprise Institute put forward a idea that Gary Becker, the Nobel laureate, coined about an immigration tariff, which would again set into play a nationality-neutral element and indeed allow for the UK and London, obviously part of the UK, to attract the very best talent from around the world and not just from the European Union.
Nancy Green, from what we've seen from this leaked document, is it a leveling of the playing field, as Rory Broomfield just said, or is this Britain first and, well, a nationalist policy?
Well, I don't want to comment on Britain specifically, but I think that all countries have had this sort of tension between who or what type of immigrant to let in. The United States as well, historically, Canada, other major immigration countries have struggled between deciding that, that people can come in with families, but always having, this has been true many times, of deciding, of wanting labor and wanting specific types of labor. Wanting labor that is high skilled. That has been true of U.S. policy also for a long time. And then can people bring their families? So this is actually part of a package. And what Britain is struggling with, and of course with this, what's specific about the EU situation with Britain is indeed its own situation, but there are similarities with the kinds of issues that are involved. One thing that I note, however, which is perhaps new in a lot of the immigration debate, is about high-skilled immigrants, because everyone wants the high-skilled immigrants. There's a sort of competition for them. The remark that that the mayor of London is concerned about the economic impact. So are Silicon Valley people. So there is the question about high-skilled immigrants is not new, but it is interesting that now some of them are being turned back, that this is part of a new discussion, actually.
The consulting group Opinium found that the percentage of Britons in a survey who think that there's no more room for migrants had little to do with population pressure. Instead, the numbers closely resemble, if you look at the map of the UK that we're showing here, the result of the Brexit vote itself. London with 40% being the lowest. London home to the most migrants proportionally in Britain, but whose economy has rebounded the most since the crisis of 2008. Maria Stonehouse of Opinion concluding Londoners do not see economic migration as a significant threat to their livelihoods, except where the competition for employment is high, such as in construction. Jamie Kirchick, this dichotomy between London and other parts of the UK, it's something that's also playing out in the US, where you have a polarization that is according to where you live in the United States.
Well, it reminds me of the poll you just mentioned in the last segment, showing that there's decreasing support for the wall the closer you get to the Mexico border. And I think what we've seen in many places is that you see this support for more restrictionist immigration policies in places where there's actually very little immigrants living. There are more rural areas where there aren't that many immigrants, and that's the same in the United States as it's the same in the UK. So there's less knowledge of immigrants, and there's less knowledge of the benefits and the costs of immigration. I think the reason for this has more to do with sort of broader economic transformation questions, and that we've seen around the world that the sort of shakeup in the global economy is that metropolitan areas are doing better for a variety of reasons having to do with, automation and artificial intelligence and lots of complicated reasons. But that metropolitan areas are doing better, and that more rural areas are not doing better. And that one way in which this is being manifested or expressed is opposition to immigration, which might not even really be related to the reasons why there are these economic problems. I don't think that immigration is the reason why we have this long-term unemployment problem that Roy was talking about earlier. I don't think that's due to immigration. I think it has to do with other factors having to do with changes in the economy. The fact that Western economies are becoming less industrial based, that factory jobs are moving to the developing world, and that we're going to have to change the ways in which people work in Western economies. So this is it's all very complicated, and I think it's very easy to blame these problems on immigration. And that's just a simplistic, scapegoat for far deeper structural changes that are occurring in the developed world.
Roy Beck, your thoughts?
Well, I don't think immigration is the cause of these problems either, but immigration does not make sense against the background of these kind of problems, and it exacerbates those problems, and it's something that the government causes. It's totally in the control of the government how many immigrants we bring in each year. And I can tell you that the polling this year shows that Americans of all sectors agree with the folks in England that, or even more so, I suppose, that American jobs ought to go to Americans. And when they say Americans, they mean Americans and the legal immigrants that are already here. One of the big issues right now is the RAISE Act. The RAISE Act is something that President Trump said that he's willing to have a DACA amnesty if the RAISE Act is attached to it. I think I've just lost my my earpiece. But the RAISE Act would reduce immigration by about half, from 1 million a year back to the 500,000 a year, which we had back in the 1980s, not so long ago. And it would do that by eliminating the family chain migration that's beyond spouse and minor children. American people have always been in favor of immigrants bringing their family, but that's spouse and minor children. So we're going to see a major debate over the next few months over whether people can compromise. The people who want the amnesty, are they willing to reduce future legal immigration of lower skilled immigrants? Or are they going to continue to leave the DACA people in this limbo of not having jobs, but also not being forced to leave?
Nancy Green, the leaked paper talks as well about this narrowing of the definition of who can come and join the person who's working in the UK. The rules right now rather vague when it comes to that on the European level.
And the questions about family reunification are not new. The definition of who belongs to a family, of course, is being debated in the U.S. as well as in Europe. That is what level of family member is allowed in. The 1965 Act in the United States was even called the Brothers and Sisters Act because it included family reunification in a way that went beyond actually what the writers of the legislation anticipated, and therefore allowed a great change, really, in the demography of the United States. I'd just like to come back one moment to the economic issue, because the economists have said over and over the importance of immigration for the economy. And both, this is again a historical fact, but it's also something that today has been repeated often enough, not just obviously in the high-tech industry, also the growers in the southwest of the United States, construction around the country. It is true there are jobs and there are other people who can also take those jobs. They have to be both found, be trained well enough. It's an education issue. But the economy, the immigrants, even statistically, are often more dynamic. There is a kind of a dynamism of some of the immigrants, which I think is to their credit. They really are trying. So the economic issue, I think, still is something that's quite important.
Rory Broomfield, the number of immigrants to the UK went down last year. A survey out this Wednesday in the Daily Telegraph shows that for foreigners, London is no longer a choice destination for expatriates. Do those things alarm you?
Oh, well, actually, the last one does slightly, but not in the round. You've got to remember, in terms of the elections that we've had in the UK over the past few years, the Conservative Party has been elected a number of times, now with a minority government, but previously with a majority, on a pledge to reduce net immigration from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands. And this plan, in a way, is, a discussion paper is, I think, one way of attempting to do that, or at least attempting to get near to that particular goal. And again, it's the concentration on the quality rather than the quantity of individuals coming into the United Kingdom.
Concentration on the quality instead of the quantity, but what's that going to mean in the long run if Jamie Kirchick is right, and that the reason why you have this sort of two-speed country where the urban areas fare better than the rural areas, that if it all continues along this way, can you keep it together is the question. Is it possible in the future to just pick and choose that way?
Well, again, we've got to also remember that London is a huge net tax exporter around the United Kingdom. So it contributes tens of billions, I can't remember the exact number, but tens of billions to the public services across the United Kingdom, including in education and health services, transport and other means. So actually the sense of London growing helps the United Kingdom in general, but also actually in terms of economic progression, there's a diffusion effect from London elsewhere with the skills and the talents that don't just concentrate in London, but go elsewhere, whether it be to Manchester, Birmingham, or indeed other cities and broadly communities around the United Kingdom. So I genuinely think what's best for London and indeed other areas around the United Kingdom is best genuinely for the UK as a whole, because under one legal situation, as we will be after we leave the European Union, Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales, we will be able to enjoy the fruits of the talents from immigrants and indeed from those in the United Kingdom going forward.
Is that the future that you see, Jamie Kirchick?
Well, I think it's interesting that what we just heard is that London is a net contributor to the rest of the UK. And it's very similar in the United States, where we have the richer, more urban states in the Northeast, New York, California, are heavily subsidizing the more rural parts of the United States. If you look at the tax transfers, in all ways, shapes, and forms. And so it's sort of ironic that these are the parts, these parts of the countries are the ones that are complaining about, immigration and whatnot, when in some sense they're benefiting from the very diverse cosmopolitan cities where a lot of immigrants live and work and pay taxes. And that those taxes and that the fruits of that labor is actually going back and subsidizing the more rural anti-immigrant parts of the country. And I think that's the case in the UK, and it's similarly the case in the United States.
All right, and it's a story, of course, that's developing and will continue to develop. Jamie Kirchick and Roy Beck, I want to thank you both for joining us from Washington. I want to thank as well Rory Broomfield in London, Nancy Green. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Nadia Massi. Hello. I forgot. We've been saying DACA so much I've forgotten what the acronym stands for. Nancy Green, help me out here. Oh, I'm sorry. Pop quiz.
I knew.
All right.
Politics quiz here in the studio. Yeah.
Action.
Well, what I'm here to talk to you about is how this has been polarizing the internet, particularly in the United States. No big surprise, really, that. Many people see this as quite a blow to the idea of the American dream, particularly people in the tech hub in Silicon Valley. We've heard from the CEO of Google. He says, dreamers are our neighbors, our friends, and our co-workers. This is their home. Moving on, we've also got Tim Cook. There it is. Tim Cook from Apple. Similar message from him. He says, 250 of my Apple co-workers are dreamers. The mouse is doing its thing. Yeah. That's what it says. If you add to that Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Bradley Smith of Microsoft, all of whom say that they'll fight to keep dreamers in the United States, you really get this sense of where the tech industry stands on this issue. That said, on the other side of the argument, there are people who say they know this is an issue which does pull at people's heartstrings, but they say the law needs to be upheld. One example simply is Mike Huckabee, the Republican. He says it's not about doing what's popular, it's about doing what's right. Now, there are people who are on his side of the debate who have been a little more strident in the way that they've expressed themselves. We've got Paul Netlin, he's a Republican congressional candidate. He said, DACA is unconstitutional, okay, but then he goes on to say, send them home to do good work, in quotes, in their own country. And really it is from politicians like him down to ordinary people on Twitter that we've seen that this debate has become really quite polemical, in many cases quite aggressive as well.
You know, we've had many debates in this very set about brain drain and how the West sucks the best talents from other parts of the world. This talk of only allowing the skilled workers in. What's your reaction to that?
It's a long and old debate, the issue of brain drain. In this case, I just want to get back to the facts, though, of the DACA of the Dreamers, is that they have been raised in the United States. They don't know their so-called home countries. Yeah. They don't so often speak the language. They have acted and they feel American, as Thomas said at the very beginning. Yeah. So it's a different thing. And also the question of what is the criminality here if they themselves, it's not really, they're not the ones who crossed the border illegally, consciously, because they were children. Yeah. So can they be prosecuted for something that, let's say, their parents did that was illegal?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, as you say, there's lots of polemics going around this, but many of them, as you say, did arrive in the United States when they were very young. We've got this article, I think, from the New York Times, which does try to add some much-needed facts into the conversation. They've got a couple of graphics here. This one showing us that the vast majority of them live in California. It says most of them came from Mexico. Most of them came when they were around 6 years old. And I think particularly crucial to the conversation that you've been having on the debate today, it says that most of them are what we might call white-collar workers, professionals working in offices, working in businesses, rather than working in kind of blue-collar jobs.
Success stories.
Success stories, indeed. The American dream, some people might argue. But I think either way, when you look at this, whether you're tweeting facts from the New York Times or whether you're kind of ranting on Facebook, there is this perception with stories like this that take on a life of their own on Twitter, that you're actually kind of just talking into the ether, that you are speaking into the echo chamber. And BuzzFeed is trying to counter that. They've got this new series called Outside Your Bubble, where they acknowledge that lots of the things that people read on BuzzFeed may only reach quite a small audience, presumably, you know, relatively young, relatively liberal Americans. And with that in mind, they have on this Dreamer story pushed forward with a few tweets that they say those people who read BuzzFeed might not have found. Here's just one that I wanted to highlight for you. It's cute how they call them dreamers. They broke the law, or somebody did to get them here. If Americans did that elsewhere, they'd be gone, and I presume by that he means they'd be deported. Now, I do like this idea that BuzzFeed is putting forward, but I have to say, if that's the most sophisticated arguments they can come up with as an alternative, I think there's a bit more work to do.
All right, Nadia Massi, many thanks.
My pleasure.
I want to thank you as well, Nancy Green. I want to thank the rest of our panel, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.